Good morning. My name is Diego Zarrate, and today I will present the research called Identification of Suitable Habitat Patches and Landscape Connectivity for Small Carnivores in the Caribbean region. The Caribbean region and the wildlife that inhabit it have been affected by different threats that have been happening in the last years, most of them related with the transformation of forests to agricultural areas, reducing all the amount of natural undisturbed ecosystems. This creates a problem of habitat loss and fragmentation, which affect all biodiversity, including small mammals, small carnivores, and also, several of these species are affected by hunting and wild trafficking. In a recent research, we have found that even that we assume that some of these problems are affecting the species, there is not a specific knowledge of where these species are distributed, which is the size of their home range, or what are other ecological information that is needed to do a proper planning. So the knowledge gaps are presented in this region as a huge threat. For the Caribbean region, a total of 12 species of small carnivores have been reported. From these, two genera still maintain some taxonomic difficulties, and there is not certainty of which of the species are actually in the area. For the present project, we review all the information of all the species existing in both universities and museums. We will try to answer some questions for each of the small carnivore species of the Caribbean. The first is which are the environmental needs of the species? The second one is which patches could support the small carnivores in the Caribbean region within their environmental ecological niche? The third is based on the restriction of the matrix that surround the suitable habitat, which could be the potential least cost path route between patches? And the last one is to identify which are the most important areas for small carnivores research and management based on the amount of habitat that exists in the area. Some of our hypotheses are that there is going to be a difference between generalist and specialist species. This difference will be related in the total number of patches and also the connectivity between them. Also, we think there will be a relationship between the presence of habitat suitability of all the species and the mountain landscapes, as these are the areas that still maintain natural coverage and could have patches of the size needed for these species. As a last hypothesis, we assume that the populations are isolated. At this moment, we think that the range that exists of these species could be connected, but the amount of habitat or suitable patches within that range will not exist anymore based on the transformation of land coverage of the last years. The methodology was divided in 4 steps. The first one was the review of all the presence points of all the species for the Caribbean region. With those points, we go to the second part, what is the creation of presence-only species distribution models. For this, we use a different set of environmental criteria that could explain the presence of habitat suitability. Using that distribution of habitat, we select priority patches. For this, we identify places that have a cover type that is related with the habitat of the species, and use only those patches that were bigger than the individual home range. With that information, we start to do landscape connectivity analysis. So we use those patches to do a least cost path and also calculate the median dispersal distance of each species to identify how much could they move between one patch and another, and define that as a threshold to create our focal patch analysis. For this project, we only use those species that have more than 60 points of high reliability. These 4 species were divided between generalist or specialist habits. All the information was acquired and selected from the database Pantheria. Based on the information that we have of the individual home range of each species, we could calculate the maximum dispersal distance and the median dispersal distance that we will use in the next steps. For each of the species, we construct different models using different environmental criteria and define as the one to use the one that presents the biggest area of undercooked value. Here we can see the two models of distribution selected for the two generalist species. And also within the model, we can see the patches that are related to the land coverage that was selected as habitat for the species, and also the patches that have a size bigger than the individual home range of each of the species. Here we can see the same approach but from the point of view of the specialist species. And we can see that they are more restricted to some specific areas, mostly in the south of the Caribbean, and also the patches and the amount of patches that are good for them based on the fact that they need some forest coverage are lower in terms of numbers and size. Using that information, we develop focal patch maps and least cost path routes for each of the species. As we can see, the generalist species have a wider distribution and have a more amount of habitat around all the Caribbean region, but still maintain some separation between the north and south patches. For the results of the specialized species, we find two different scenarios. The species of the left, Nasua nasua, has a really low value of maximum dispersal distance. Remember that this value was the one that we used to define the circle in the focal patch to do the density analysis. So in this one, as the dispersal distance is too slow, we can see these small circles where the habitat is high or low, the amount of habitat is high or low. The species seems, for the whole Caribbean, really isolated. The right one, even that it's an specialized species, has a really high value of dispersal distance, one of the highest of the four species that we used. That's why we see that even that the patches are small and are isolated from the rest of the north of the Caribbean, the amount of habitat that surrounds them and the density of the focal patch is really high. Even based on that, we have to take into account that this species, Pothos flavus, is one that is really constrained to forest habitats, and probably that dispersal rate is not taking into account the restriction of some of the gradient that, for example, the Lisco spot let us see here. As a conclusion, we see that there is a difference between what's happening in terms of number of patch and size of the total habitat patches of the Caribbean region between generalist and specialist species. We can see how the Eira barbara and Procyon cancrivorus have more number of patches and a bigger area for the whole Caribbean. Also, we can see that there is a relationship between the presence of habitat and the mountain landscapes. We can see in these black circles the places where the highest richness of species should occur based on the species distribution models, and these fall within some of the mountain ranges that exist in the Caribbean. Also, we see that the connectivity problems that the species could have based on the methodology could be identified equally using either least cost path or a focal patch analysis, but we have to take into account the variability and probable constraints that the use of dispersal distance could have when including them in a focal patch. Thank you very much.